Okay, guys, picking back up with question number 7. So, for question 7, we're talking about the Enlightenment philosophers of Europe and their kind of importance and influence on the early American government. So, first of all, we have John Locke. His kind of idea was natural rights, that all people are born with these rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, and that it's the government's duty and job to protect these rights. Next, we have Jean Jacques Rousseau. His idea was that government is essentially a social contract. People enter into an agreement with the government. The government agrees to uphold and protect rights, and people agree to follow laws. Montesquieu, his kind of idea was the separation of powers to make sure that no one branch or one person got too powerful in government, which leads us to having separate branches in our government today. For question 8, identify why each of the following was important to colonial history. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement that the Pilgrims on the Mayflower made to be governed by a common set of laws. Again, they gave the government power. In exchange for that power, they agreed to follow those laws. Consent of the governed is kind of the idea here. The Virginia House of Burgesses, this is the first representative government in the New World where people elect representatives who would then be in charge of making laws. The New England town meetings was governments that were established at the local level. This allowed citizens what we call direct democracy. They directly took part in the lawmaking process. Finally, we have the trial of John Peter Zenger. This trial helped establish the idea of freedom of the press as a fundamental right. Number 9, describe the relationship between the colonies and England prior to 1763. So we use the term salutary neglect to describe this relationship. Essentially, England would leave the colonies alone, let them kind of run things themselves and have their own sort of small self-government. How did this change after the French and Indian War in 1763? So after the war was over, England needed money because they were in so much debt from the war. Because of this, they decided to take a more direct role in the lives of colonists and basically try to raise money from the colonies to pay off that debt. So they ended salutary neglect after the French and Indian War. Moving on for number 10, we're going to describe each of these events and how they helped lead to the American Revolution. So the Proclamation of 1763, this was passed to prevent colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was the first step away from salutary neglect, and it angered the colonists quite a bit. The Sugar Act of 1764, this basically enforced a tax that already existed on sugar and molasses and stopped smuggling. It was meant to raise money for Great Britain. This also angered the colonists and was eventually taken away when the colonists resisted. The Stamp Act, we got to be careful with this one. It was not a tax on stamps. What it was a tax on printed materials and paper goods like wills and newspapers. The colonists also protested this, and this was also eventually repealed. The next one down, no taxation without representation. This was kind of a motto or a slogan or a rallying cry of the revolution. The colonists weren't opposed to taxation in and of itself. What they wanted, though, was representation in Parliament, which is the British government. They wanted a say in how they were taxed. The Tea Act in 1772, this took away taxes on British East India tea, which made British tea cheaper, colonial tea more expensive, and essentially gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea. This leads to the Boston Tea Party. The next one down, the Intolerable Acts. This was a response to the Boston Tea Party. Response to the Boston Tea Party, not the Boston Massacre. This closes Boston Harbor. It shuts down the Massachusetts state legislatures. This allows the quartering of troops, and it also took British soldiers to Britain for trial. So we're going to correct this and say British response to Boston Tea Party. Finally, the First Continental Congress. This was a meeting of delegates from the colonies on how best to respond to the Intolerable Acts, and it was the first kind of example of colonial unity coming together against the British. As far as our timeline in here of events, the first event to happen was the French-Indian War ending. The second was the Boston Massacre. The third was the Declaration of Independence. The fourth was the ratification of the Articles of Confederation. The fifth was Shays' Rebellion. The sixth was the writing of the U.S. Constitution. The seventh was the ratification of the Constitution. And finally, the eighth was the passage of the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments. Question 12, what are our 3 parts of the Declaration of Independence? The first part is the statement of principles of good government. The second is kind of the list of grievances or complaints against the king. And finally, that last part of the Declaration was our official split from Great Britain. We'll pick back up with question 13 in the next video.